We're going to start this series today called Who Needs Christmas? Now, the timing this year is kind of weird with Thanksgiving being so early. I mean, it was the 22nd this year. That's as early as I can ever remember it being. Next year, it'll be late. It'll be the 28th. And so we'll have to deal with that adjustment there. So I thought, well, we could do another generosity sermon, or we can just jump into the 4 here for Christmas and talk about, do we really need Christmas? Who really needs Christmas? And that can be a challenging question when you think about it, because different people come into this part of the year with different feelings, for sure. I know it's an exciting time of the year for a lot of people, for kids and schools out, although most of the schools were out all this week too, which I did not realize that they took all of the week off for Thanksgiving, so they got lots of time off. It can also be exhausting, it can be conflicting, and it can be depressing. It depends on your frame of mind. It depends on what you're going through in your life, what your circumstances are in your life. Because on one side of the question is all the family and the fun and the food and the presents. And then there is this reality that God sent His Son to do what we could not do for ourselves, and that brings joy. And God sent His Son in such a unique way, so different from anybody else who ever came to this earth. And so there's a lot to celebrate, isn't there? A lot to celebrate at Christmas. But on the other side of the question is all the family and food, put on weight, the bills of the Christmas presents, the struggling of dealing with loss at Christmas, especially this time of year when you're dealing with the loss of a loved one, or maybe something's happened in your relationships that have really wounded you. And so we have this kind of conflict that goes on at Christmas too. As a matter of fact, I coined a word, and I don't think it's really a word, but it's a word today because it's in my sermon, so it's a word, and that is the word joyful confliction. Joyful confliction. Christmas is about joyful confliction. You see, if you add all of these moments together and you have all of the joy mixed with all of the conflict, you have joyful confliction. And most people have that in some way or another. Some years the joy wins out. Other years it's the conflict that wins out. Some years it's both. And so you have this conflict between the good and the bad, even at Christmas. And I think all of us deal with that on some level, at some way, at Christmas time. We deal with conflict and joy. And what does that mean? I mean, how do we deal with that in our life? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Our text this morning comes from Isaiah chapter 9, and it's really a text for the whole series. We'll call attention to it each week and then bounce into other scriptures. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." We're going to look at all 4 of those descriptions this month on Sunday mornings, and we're going to look at them carefully about what they mean for us in our lives. God blessed the people that He chose and He loved, and He blessed them from the very beginning. And one of the things that God was really good about with the Israelites is He was really good about releasing them from bondage. And He did that after 400 years in Egypt. And then He rescued them over and over and over again. Even when they would turn their backs on Him, He would still rescue them. There was never a doubt that God had the superior hand over everybody else here on earth, and that the people would be set free. And what would happen is the people would be set free, and there would be this time of joy, and there would be this time of happiness, and everybody would be celebrating. And then they'd go on back to their lives, and they'd start doing the same things that they had done before, and they'd get involved in temptation, and they'd get involved in idolatry, and they'd get involved in turning their back on God. And eventually it caused God to send some kind of judgment upon them to remind them that He was there and He was loving them through all of this. But it ended up being that they would just get in this cycle where they'd get free, and then they'd have joy, and then they'd turn their back on God and walk away from God. And God would say, what do I need to do to get your attention? And he would get their attention, and they'd say, oh, God, we've turned our back on you, and we want to be set free again. And the whole book of Judges is really a chronicle of that cycle over and over and over again, where they would be set free, and then they would turn their back on God, and God would be back there doing it again, because God wanted to save them from themselves as much as anything. Joy in worship often leads to complacency and sin, which leads to God removing his hand of blessing upon his people. Life would get so bad that there would be no more joy, only conflict at every corner of life, and then the people would cry out to God. They'd say, oh God, save us. And God would rush in and save them. We see this happening, especially in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges. After Moses had died, Joshua was selected to be the leader of Israel. In Judges chapter 2, which you can turn there if you want, we'll spend a little bit of time in here. Judges chapter 2 talks about how they reacted to God picking Joshua as the king of Israel, as the leader of Israel, if you want to say it that way. During the lifetime of Joshua, the people served the Lord through the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen great things that the Lord had done for Israel. That's Judges 2:7. It would seem at this point that the future of Israel would be secure and they were headed in the right direction, but not so fast. Because we read in Judges chapter 2, verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord or what he had done for Israel. Now think about that, the impact of that statement. That one generation removed from Joshua, nobody remembered the stories of what had happened in Egypt. The rescue of the people and the parting of the Red Sea and all the miracles and the plagues and all of that stuff. That this generation that grew up behind Joshua, those stories had not been told, and they'd not been told in an authoritative way, and so nobody really knew those stories at all. And I think, man, that is crazy when you think about it. Just one generation. And somebody will come along and say, we're just one generation away from being extinct as a faith. And it's true, if we don't invest in the next generation, that can happen. And it shows up in the Bible over and over and over. The people had sunk to new lows, and that made them vulnerable, and not just to individual kings, but also to kingdoms like Assyria and Babylon, who would plunder them and take them captive, and even take their land away from them and make them servants of theirs, just like they were in Egypt hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. They had forgotten God. Now, I don't know about you. It's hard for me to forget about God, but I can get so busy and so in tune with what's going on in my own life that sometimes God gets shoved off to the sidelines. Anybody else have that problem? I think we all do to some degree. God knew of their shortcomings and their sin. He also saw their suffering, and he knew that if the people of God were really ready to understand